Case. Hi.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Abby. So welcome everyone to join this webinar on evoked sets. So let's start off with the title, When the Marketplace Seems Too Big, Using Evoked Sets to Model How Shoppers Buy. So basically, conjoint analysis is used to understand trade-offs. So many shopper decisions involve trade-offs. So for example, if your client wants to know what happens if I increase my price, what happens to my market share, for example, or what if I increase the size of my pack and thereby increasing the revenue by also charging more money, I might add some more cash flow to my company. Or what if you want to know what happens if competition starts changing the prices? Should I react? Should I stay stable, etc., really to get a deep understanding of the preference structure on the market from your consumer. Well, conjoint analysis is one of the most often used techniques to understand and predict how shoppers actually make those trade-offs, so we can give advice to our clients on what to do with their pricings. Well, some trade-offs, and here's where the fun starts, they occur in a large competitive space. So a grocery store may have hundreds of SKUs that are relevant to a category. So on the picture you see an example of soups, for example. Well, it's going to be an easy exercise with just 3 soups on the market, but apparently there are hundreds and hundreds of SKUs just concerning soups. Of course, we can program realistic shelf sets using all those hundreds of SKUs and have people do like a virtual exercise, walking up and down the aisle and make choices, etc., etc. But my personal issue with that is you cannot have dozens of choice tasks showing these big virtual aisles to respondents. And essentially, a computer screen is not a store. So the big question is, what if we have actually too many products to show on a computer screen? Well, using evoked sets can help you when you are in this particular situation, i.e. when you have a large market space. Because essentially when people start buying, what is this example? I think it's soaps. When people start buying soaps, they're not considering all hundreds of SKUs when making a selection. No, essentially in their mind, people already make certain decision rules to narrow down the selection to base choices upon. So shoppers already make decisions to get their consideration set smaller. So they don't need to focus on all hundreds of SKUs, but only on a subset of SKUs. So essentially what the evoked set is, we're going to customize the choice exercises we're going to show them on the screen to only show products that are relevant to them. So we actually help them in narrowing down the products to review. What also happens, it makes it easier for the respondent to focus. So imagine you have hundreds of SKUs on the screen instead of 30. It's very difficult to constantly apply those underlying decision rules everybody has in their mind to start looking for, well, I'm actually only interested in these 10 products. Because essentially what you do with the evoked set, you only show them those 10 products. So the survey also becomes more relevant for a respondent. And the respondent becomes more engaged. In the previous version of the PowerPoint, we had a really happy respondent picture, but unfortunately it's gone now. But you'll get happy respondents too. And if you have happy respondents, you also get better data quality, which is also something we always struggle to get. So if you get your respondents more engaged, you get better data quality, you get better answers to your clients. But how do we customize actually the product that we show to a respondent? Well, the typical way of doing this is to ask a couple of questions before the choice exercise. So we ask a couple of indirect questions to tell us which products are actually relevant to them. So you could use that using past behavior. So you could ask questions like, well, in the past 3 months, which products did you actually buy? You could also ask, okay, which products did you actually consider? You could also ask about future behavior. So when you start buying into this product category X, which product would you actually consider? But also, which products would you actually never consider? Just to give a very stupid example, when buying into cars, I would actually consider Ferraris, but I could never afford them, so they're not in my consideration set or in my evoked set. And another way of doing this is to ask for any must-haves or unacceptables. So going back to the soap example, well, I definitely want one of those pumps on them because that's very, very neat. So I'm very interested in SKUs that have like a pump on them. And we do not typically just use one screening criterion, but multiple ones, because we want to avoid that we actually eliminate SKUs that are relevant to a respondent. One downside, well, let's call it a challenge. You do need some programming expertise to only show relevant SKUs to a respondent. So on one hand, we have the evoked set of SKUs coming from the multiple screening criteria that I just explained. And whenever possible, and if you still have room to fill on the screen, you can fill those products up with random non-evoked products to make it a bit more realistic. Because if you walk into a physical brick and mortar store, there aren't just the products that you are interested in, there's also other products. So combining those two rules, you get a customized but structured and meaningful shelf set. But this sounds all great and all, but there are some disadvantages or things to consider when using evoked sets. Because even when applying all those rules, we still might be eliminating products that the respondent would actually be interested in. So this introduces a selection bias, and we have to do some more complex modeling to account for this. So when using evoked sets, you do require some analytical expertise to overcome these disadvantages. So for the selection bias, well, most mathematical models assume that when data is missing, it's missing at random. And when you run a conjoint with evoked sets, all we know is that the respondent has not seen certain items. So we need to inform our model that missing items actually mean undesirable, that they are not interesting. There's two broad ways of doing this. The first one is to add synthetic data into your modeling. So you can add the SKUs that were not seen by a respondent into the model and just assume they were not picked, because that's basically the assumption you make when you create an evoked set. Or another method is to define a threshold where the parts that were in the evoked set beat a certain threshold, where the threshold means, well, actually all products above this certain threshold are desirable, or at least I'm considering them, and all the other products are losing to this threshold. I'll get into more detail on the next slide on this one. And the other option is respondent level penalized regression. That's a really, really long term, but basically you can specify individual level constraints. So for each shopper that you interviewed, you can say, well, this SKU that you haven't seen, yeah, you don't want this. Just to inform the model that if you haven't seen something, it's undesirable. And the easiest way of doing this is to set the predictions in your market simulations on the individual level to not get picked by this respondent. So just a little bit more on the threshold. I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer. Yes, you can. So imagine there's 8 SKUs in total, and I've only used 4 SKUs in evoked set. I'm going to add a couple of synthetic choice tasks where I say, well, these 4 SKUs in your consideration or in your evoked set are better than this threshold, and the ones you haven't seen are actually worse than the threshold. One other challenge to overcome with evoked set is if you have hundreds of SKUs, you actually run into sparsity of data, because you can only ask so many choice tasks to a respondent, and eventually you still estimate a bunch of parameters for each respondent. So there's data sparsity. And it's also very easy to start overfitting the data. So eventually you will estimate a model with hundreds of parameters, and you only have 12 choice tasks. So be very wary of that. So you need to calibrate and tune your models for this sparsity. One other thing is not just for very large marketplaces, but even more so with large market spaces, because it's very easy to run into IIA problems or red bus, blue bus, So typically, larger marketplaces have nesting structures. So I think this is an example of soft drinks. So certain people make choices between, well, in my decision tree, I'm going to focus on diet sodas, for example. So I'm going to ignore non-diets. And then within diet, I'm going to make a decision between brand A or B. And then within brand A, I'm going to review different sizes. The problem is not everybody has the same nesting structure. So what you actually see do is run different nesting structures and use an ensemble of those different nesting structures to come up with your final predictions. And I have to admit, this is still a bit experimental. We've done a couple of studies, but we haven't really standardized this approach yet. But this is definitely something we're working on. So just wrapping up, using evoked sets do enable you to study a large marketplace of products where you customize the survey for each individual respondent. So get more engaged respondents. However, you do need some programming expertise. Be careful when you create your evoked sets, because all the assumptions you make need to hold true in reality as well. If you make the wrong assumptions, you'll make wrong predictions. Adding non-evoked products into the evoked set is recommended because it already helps a little bit in overcoming the selection bias. And as indicated before, you do need analytical expertise to use evoked sets, because you need to solve the selection bias issue, you need to calibrate your data for the data sparsity, and eventually, if there's time and money, you should model the natural groupings or the nests. Any questions?